Hello, Mark Pack here, and just before we get to the latest podcast, a quick plug for my weekly email newsletter all about political opinion polls, The Week in Polls. Comes out every Sunday, 6 p.m, with news and analysis from the latest political polling, and you can sign up for free at theweekinpolls.co.uk.
Hello and welcome to yet another local election review from the Lib Dem podcast and the Never Mind the Bar Charts podcast. I'm John Potter. I'm the producer and host of the Lib Dem podcast. And before we get into the details of the results, we want to say a huge congratulations to those teams and candidates that got over the line, but also commiserations on people that didn't quite get it this time. You know, in Preston, that was us last year. We left feeling pretty flat, and there's always another day and there's always another election, but what you did in standing is so important. And lastly, before we get into the meat and the weeds of this issue, we want to put a special tribute out to Lord Andrew Stunnell, who sadly passed away a couple of days before the elections last year. Andrew was the epitome of what Lib Dem community politics is about. He was a councillor, who was then an MP, who was a minister, and then a member of the House of Lords. But beyond all that, he was a decent bloke and a very kind human, and he will be sorely, sorely, sorely missed by so many people who knew him, and particularly our family and friends within the Lib Dems in Stockport. So, Andrew, rest in peace. And I'm sure seeing us beat the Tories in the local elections would have gladdened your heart no end, and exactly what you'd expect us to do. So we now get on with the rest of the episode. In case you didn't realise, the Lib Dems did quite well in these local elections, performing 26,000% better than Reform. However, we're going to get into the weeds of that on whether we should be happy with that result, what this means for all the major parties and Reform, but also what this means going forward for the election as well. So with me, we have, of course, the host of the Never Mind the Bar Charts podcast, which is Mark Pack. Hello, Mark.
Lovely to join you, John, and to be able to congratulate you in person, as it were, on your own stonking results.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to try and not bring in Preston into loads of this, but it's obviously going to happen at some point.
Don't worry, I will.
Thank you. Okay, great stuff. We also have the leader of Horsham Council, Martin Boffey. Hello, Martin.
Hi, John. Good morning, and it is a very good morning. So, yeah, and well done from me as well.
Wonderful. And the leader of the opposition on Barnsley Council, Hannah Kitchen, who again had a brilliant set of results. Welcome, Hannah, and congratulations. Have you slept since?
Oh, yeah, I have slept. Haven't slept for a good couple of weeks, but I've slept now. Congratulations to you, John, as well. I did wonder if we should perhaps not allow you to host this podcast so that we could, maybe blow smoke up your backside rather than you doing it to yourself. So, yeah, massive congratulations to you. Epic results in Preston.
Thank you very much. It's weird me being the topic of it, but we'll crack on. So let's go with, okay, Martin, you were one of the people that didn't have elections this time other than Police and Crime Commissioner. So what were your initial reaction to the results that have come out? Just a very quick, just kind of general view of the results in total.
Very, very good indeed. Exactly where we want to be. I think, sometimes depends who you're talking to. I think, generally speaking, yeah, really, really excited, but those are really sort of into the nerdy campaign tactics. It's a bit more of a kind of a quietly confident, yeah, that's good, but we need more of the same, is what I would say. There was something going on around my region, even though we didn't have elections, but maybe we'll come back to that later.
Yeah. Hannah, what about you? As someone on the coal face during this election in a tough battles in the Labour-facing area?
Yeah, so I think, like you say, when you're on the sort of, sharp end of it, you end up in a bit of a tunnel vision type hole, which is certainly where I was right through until midday on Saturday, really, when the South Yorkshire mayoral was declared. But obviously, you're getting thousands of WhatsApp messages and seeing updates and things. No Twitter updates for me though, because I'm currently banned from Twitter. I think that might be a permanent state. So yeah, for me, in Barnsley, we got everything we set out to achieve. Happy to talk about that in a little bit more detail later on. Across South Yorkshire, more of a mixed picture. And across Yorkshire and Humber as well, more of a mixed picture. But really, really delighted first thing on Friday to see that we'd held the council in Hull. So I think we lost 3, and I think we lost 3 and gained 1, so we were net down 2. But held the council, which is what's important. And I think really for all of us in Labour-facing areas, it's been tough for a few years. It felt tougher this year. But I know what's the sort of the chat in the Labour-facing areas is this has to be the high watermark. This has to be the high watermark for Labour. It's not going to get any better for them than this.
And Mark, I suppose you give us your assessment, and actually we should probably go through the finished figures for the whole contest as well. We'll get into the mayoralities and stuff later, but actually the local elections, your initial impression.
I mean, there's lots of great stuff to say about places where we won, and we end this parliament having made more net gains through all of the local elections this parliament than Labour or the Greens, up 768 seats if you add up the different May elections together. And in fact, up by more than that if you add in as well our council by-elections in between each May. And that's a fantastic in its own right, but also a really important growth of the party's grassroots strength for our success at other levels of election. But in an almost slightly paradoxical way, I think where there are definitely some people who will be listening to this who have just missed out, and, you know, we should absolutely sympathise with them. But I hope a lot of them will take hope from even where we didn't quite get it over the line this time. So I was helping on polling day in part in a ward which we missed out in the end on by 6 votes. Real shame, nor lovely, lovely candidate. Silver lining, though, is that it's in a constituency that's a parliamentary target seat for us, and we managed to really squeeze the Labour vote, and we managed to really frame, once again, elections as being a Lib Dem versus Tory fight. That's good news for gaining the parliamentary seat. It's good news for, I really hope, when Nor's had a chance to have some rest, that he decides to go for the ward again in future. And so I think there's a lot of those stories where if you look at the less successful results, there is nevertheless a really big silver lining. Sunderland would be another example. They've made huge progress in this parliament, sadly slipped back slightly last week. The Tories slipped back so far that they're now in position on the council. And if you look to what politics might be like if there's a Labour Prime Minister, from very weak to being official opposition on the council this parliament, that sets up some fantastic opportunities for the next parliament. So lots of successes to celebrate, but I think also it's interesting how many of the places where we didn't quite make it, you can see for optimism for the future, not just, you know, sympathy for people who didn't quite make it, but absolutely genuine optimism that things will be even better in the future. And hey, we won more council seats than Tories. So, you know, Britain's a two-party politics system. You know, maybe the media should wake up a little bit to that.
So let's go through the numbers very, very briefly. So Labour won 1,158 seats, up 186. Lib Dems won 522, up 104. The Tories won 515, down 474, which if you look at those statistics, I think it was in the BBC showing, that is one of their worst ever results, because it's actually easy to remember. You know, you think of those big losses under Theresa May, they were under the huge sets of local elections. This was a very small set of elections. So to lose that amount is horrendous for him. And then Independents picked up an extra 93 seats. Greens picked up an extra 74, and various other odds and sods afterwards. And for those that don't know why I was being sarky about Reform picked up 2 seats in the whole of the country. You know, and I made a joke online that I picked up more than that either side of Garstang Road in Preston. So, you know, to get the attention they're getting. But we will talk about Reform later. So that was the scores on the doors for the all the parties. And I think Mark's right. It's, you know, I think when we look back, it's very easy to remember that you can be on a journey as a local party. Now, last year we were really disappointed in our local party because we missed out by 100-something votes on 2 wards, but we knew we had laid the bedrock to go on and win them, which we did this year. So I think as long as you take the learnings from that, okay, what could we do better? Because even the best campaign, there are areas where you can improve. And I think taking those learnings and finding a positive out of them and what you can do beyond that is really good. But I suppose the question is, so there's a bit of a chat here. Did Lib Dems hit their expectations? Now, I know from my work with ALDC that our bottom end of expectations was around this plus 60 seats, and our kind of a good night might be like 120 gains. So actually, we're probably smack where we want to be. Yes, there's probably a couple of councils where we've narrowly missed out taking overall control. We took 2 councils, Labour took 8, and the Tories lost 10. So it was a disaster for Tories, but we'll get to them later. But generally, Mark, expectations met, would you say, for Lib Dems?
Yeah, as you say, I think seat gains sort of bang on, really, the sort of figure we were expecting. Wonderful bonus to have the Tories were doing so badly that we actually won more seats than them. But also, I think what is really promising is not just the total number of gains was about what we were hoping for, but the spread of them, that you've got both really good results in the sorts of places where we need to be winning at the general election to have collectively a good general election, but also, again, like yourself in Preston, John, smaller council groups in lots of places growing as well. One of a couple of the very late results that were, I think people were hanging on to wait and see, because would we stay ahead of the Tories or not? If you think of the two late results from Warrington and from Salford, both small council groups. Warrington took a big step forward, Salford took a small step forward, but both, in Northern England, took a step forward. And I think the fact that it wasn't just doing well in our areas of strength was a definite bonus, which wasn't a given with, as Hannah said, this sort of year is normally the toughest year because Labour have got all of that. You've got to vote Labour to get the Tories out of Westminster message. And with things like mayor elections raising the turnout in lots of places, making it very tough in places like Manchester and so on. We could have seen a lot of those smaller groups go backwards, and we didn't. And so I think, good news all round.
Anna?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that we've probably exceeded expectations in some places and fallen short in others. I think, from the media point of view, no one expects the Lib Dems to do anything at all, do they? I've particularly enjoyed the BBC coverage that, has us clearly there in second place to Labour, having won more seats with the Tories. And the line we get is smaller parties like the Lib Dems and the Greens also did quite well. Thanks for that, lads. I think that's probably an understatement. I think what's interesting as well from a Yorkshire Northern perspective is that I guess you've got a situation up here where there's less for Labour to achieve because they're already riding quite high. But I think they will be disappointed with some of their performances. So in Sheffield, for example, where we didn't have the greatest night we've ever had. It could certainly have been worse, but we didn't have the greatest. We didn't have the greatest night. You've got a situation where Labour are at 45% in the polls. This is, as you say, their high point. I think they gained a seat from the Greens, I think, or gained a couple of seats, also lost a couple of seats. That council is still in their overall control. So, they fell short really of making gains from us and from the Greens, lost a seat to an independent seat I don't think they've ever lost before. And so, Labour at their high point, and they still don't run the council in Sheffield. So, they've got to be a little bit disappointed with that. And I think, it really sort of puts us in a position where in those Labour-facing areas, the Lib Dems are clearly set up in many places now as the opposition. We actually beat the Conservatives in a couple of our paper wards. So where we literally just stand a candidate and get, like 127 votes. The Tories got 112.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I mean, we're going to probably pivot on to. I don't think we can talk about the Lib Dems without talking about Labour and Tories at the same time. So we will just kind of. I apologise to all listeners if this goes all a bit scattergun and everywhere, but I think it's a really mixed picture out there because, as Hannah said, if you think of like the Sunderland Labour Party, probably made hit back at the Lib Dems a little bit, but the Labour Party HQ has just sacked their leader and has imposed a new leader on them. Bit like what they did in Sheffield if you don't get the results you want, the National Labour Party will come in and tell you, okay, we've got to
tell me more about this idea of national HQs being able to sack leaders, John. I'm interested all of a sudden.
Yeah, behave yourself, you. That is
Oh,
definitely.
you don't get any ideas.
Better behave yourself,
That's not
John.
really
You know.
But it is interesting, and what Hannah said about I mean, we'll talk about the Tory collapse. The Tory collapse has been utterly disastrous. For I mean, their vote. Because we do box counts, and for listeners that don't know, what a box count is when you first at the poll, when you're doing your verification, the only time you can see how polling districts are actually doing. The Tory vote isn't absolutely gone, but it's definitely there's a lot of suppression happening with the Tory vote, whether that's natural or not. And I suppose for those Lib Dems like me who have broken into new areas, we also have to be aware that, you know, the Tories aren't finished as a party. And we canvassed a Labour member who said, we don't think the Tories will get a single MP at the general election. That's clearly nonsense. You are deluded if you think this is the end of the Tory party. But Martin, you're I mean, we're still on expectations, but your view of how the Lib Dems performed in your eyes, being like slightly removed from the fray?
I was really, really happy with it. I think it was but in a way, maybe that was because I'd read some of the emails and stuff that came out from ALDC and HQ beforehand, which was sort of saying, and it went very much as they said in terms of, look, there won't really be any news for us on Friday morning because none of our good, big target things. There'll be, obviously some areas we've done well, but it's going to be all Labour stories, and it will take a while for our story to come through if it gets noticed. So I was kind of prepared for that. But some of the results and its stories, the reason it's scattergun a little bit is because it's all over all over the country. There's good or interesting stories. I mean, yourself in Preston, Hannah in Barnsley, great stories and good for the future. Stockport, really important. Okay, we don't outright control the country, but the council, but it's we're doing well in the places we need to do well, not just locally, but for the general election, which is what we're aiming to do.
And I suppose Cheltenham we have to talk about. Was it 36 out of 40 we won in Cheltenham, actually with not a single Tory councillor elected? I think there's 36 Lib Dems, 3 Greens and an independent in Cheltenham. Is astonishing, isn't it, Mark?
Yeah, and there are other places where we've wiped out the Tories, and I think this is one of the hopeful signs for us for the future, because you can look at quite a few places where the Tories were wiped out in their sort of previous wave of unpopularity, but because we in particular then established ourselves as the alternative, they've never come back since. So Haringey in North London, where I used to live, is a good example of that. They used to challenge Labour for control of the council years and years and years ago. They fell by the wayside. We wiped them off the council. And in their, even in their good year since then, they've not really got that close at all to getting even a single councillor, let alone. And so there's definitely places where this year was, in a way, our last opportunity to push the Tories to one side. And if, as is likely, although obviously not certain, we have some years of Labour government now, for us to then, have made local politics a two-party system with us now one of the two parties. And it's great to see that in lots of places, people have absolutely pulled that off. And that's why I think genuinely we can be really optimistic for the future about further local government growth.
And for those, go on, Martin.
I'll just come in and say a little bit of a word for Sussex as an area, really. Not all, some of it's Labour, but West Sussex in particular. If I think about where it was 3 years ago, the Tories controlled the county council and 6 out of the 7 districts and boroughs they had control of. They still hold the county council until next year, but all of the Ds and Bs have gone, all of them. And in the east as well, there is not a Tory council below county in Sussex now. It's massive, Now some of that obviously is Labour taking control of places, and there's this sad thing happened in Worthing this last weekend, in that we lost our last councillor down there, the Hazel Thorpe, who's been working really, really hard for many years. And so that's, one of the unfortunate things that's happened. But, across the area, it is a bit of a wipeout now.
Hannah, you want to come in?
Yeah, if I could just talk about the Tory vote up here. because I've been saying for a while, like this whole sort of general election campaign feels like the fight for the red wall, doesn't it?
Mm.
You know, we know that the sort of more traditional Conservative voters are, you know, either staying home or moving to us. And the whole sort of, you know, rhetoric that's going on in the media and out of the main party seems to be that fight for the red wall. And I think it's really, so where I mentioned our paper candidates had come above the Conservatives in Barnsley, that was always where there was a Reform candidate standing. And the Conservatives on Barnsley are down to one councillor now. Unfortunately, it's Labour that have taken them on in that ward, not us. But they beat the Conservatives by 400 votes in that ward last year. They only beat the Conservatives by 200 votes in that ward this year. This is a ward that's been Conservative councillors for like 25 years. I think they've largely been left to it, to be honest. I don't think there's been a lot of attack on them. And this is a ward within that kind of key, one of those key red wall seats that went Conservative at the last election. And in one of our target wards, also in that constituency, we find that Conservative vote really, really hard to squeeze. It remains like really quite stubbornly high. So in both of those wards, there was no Reform candidate, and that Conservative vote, again, you know, I guess if you live in Barnsley and you've voted Conservative all of your life, like you're not really upset by a bit of shenanigans down in Westminster. You just, you know, you've sort of voted against the grain all your life, and you just sort of carry on with it. So I do think, and also in Rother Valley, which is another red wall constituency that went Labour last time, one of our target wards in Rotherham is there. We did win one, that is all ups, but didn't manage to get the other two over the line. The Conservatives got the other two. So there is still a decidedly resilient Conservative vote.
Yeah, I don't think that's ever going to change though. So I mean, I was just looking. I'm just while you were there, and I was just looking at our spreadsheet because we had one Reform candidate in Preston, no Greens. So it's a fairly useful kind of barometer of where we are. So from their high watermark in 2021, the Tories have lost half their vote, which is obviously gigantic. But I was looking back at the one ward where it was a Lib Dem gain this time. The last of the Tories has now gone, and it was the one that had the Reform candidate, so which was quite useful. But if you look at the Tory vote, so 30% in 2019, peaked at 44% in 2021 when they took the seat off us, and then it's gone 30, 31, 28. So not massive swings in that number, and again Labour mixing it up a little bit. I mean, one thing we've got to be wary of is that seat in particular has a fairly large kind of working class kind of area to it, and so actually Reform took probably more off us and Labour than they did off Conservatives in that battleground. But the one thing, it like everything, and what we say to all campaigns is every ward is different, and the demographics are always different. You always have to adapt with these particular circumstances. And the three-way marginal that we had in Preston, which was an absolute bunfest, it was so tricky to figure out how we would actually fight that, because it was a Tory incumbent that the Labour won last time, and we haven't won it in about 30 years. And then the results last time, it's been marginal forever. But the Tory vote has now dropped to like 20% in that, because we gave them a decent alternative, and we hammered it basically for the whole year.
How many did you win that by? Sorry to interrupt. How many did you win that one by?
We lost it by 118 last year. We won it by about 216 this year. So this was George Kulbaki, but it's also, I mean, Mark could talk forever. And actually, if Sam was here, we'll talk about messaging. So we had two different messages, all linked together. So for the Labour leaning people, because we were really worried that we had people who voted Lib Dem last year that would go to Labour because they now know that Labour had won it the previous year, and so we saw that shift in vote. But we said, you know, George, retired teacher, Labour votes loved that. But we also said, you know, George also volunteers as a bass guitarist at his local church, and the Tories loved that. And so it is. You knowing your numbers and getting your data is going to be really important with this stuff. And we were ruthless with it in Preston, and it just got us over the line. And obviously in Preston, there's a huge issue for Labour with the Muslim vote and the Gazan vote, which obviously Sam again would talk about if he was talking about Oldham. But we got 4% of the vote across the whole of the city was spoiled ballots this time, which is over 1,000, so much more than you would usually get. So over 1,000 ballot papers, and there was a coordinated effort where it said on hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of them, no ceasefire, no vote. It was
really
constant. There were hundreds upon hundreds. Like I said, to get that level. So what the two wards bordering the largest mosque in Fulwood, where we're in the northern suburbs where we are, had like masses of them. Like I said, nearly 200 of them, all with that kind of phrasing on it. So Labour really, and I think Labour's right to be worried about that, because, and I can show you just again, I'm going to nerd out. This is the last bit. So in the ward we won, this three-way marginal, the largest kind of Muslim voting population is in SG3, and you know the local Labour Party. I'm not giving away the trade secrets here. Labour got 66% of the vote in that polling district last year, while we got 17%. Likewise for the Tories, that vote dropped to just 43% of for Labour, and we went up to 45. And that was the point during the box dance when that came in. I thought, we've got this ward, and it was, but that, yeah, go on, Hannah.
So did you say you've sort of got no alternatives for people to vote for? So there was
no Greens, no independents. Yeah,
people. Was it literally just you Labour Tories on the ballot?
Virtually for the whole of the city. Virtually, there was a couple of independents and trade unions and one Reform, but basically, yeah.
So people spoilt their ballots as an alternative to having that. So certainly, if you look at the Barnsley results, I mean, Reform, they didn't come anywhere near winning anything. They couldn't campaign their way out of a paper bag. But the wards that they stood, they got sort of upwards of 400, 450 votes, without doing anything. That's obviously not about Gaza. But that sort of protest vote, if you like, sort of anti-establishment vote. And then certainly in Sheffield, Labour lost Darnell to an independent. And that was exclusively on Gaza, completely, totally, 100% on Gaza. Big Muslim community there. He was campaigning around the mosques and things, and there was we lost a seat to the Greens as well in Sheffield, and I think some of that was potentially, apparently their candidate's really quite good on Gaza as well. It seems like where there's been, and obviously what happened in Oldham as well, where there's an alternative for people to put that protest vote, why they don't see us as a protest vote on.
It's a funny one though, because like I said, I did a lot.
I think our policy is pretty solid, but obviously not solid enough. So yeah, so where there's a protest vote, those kinds of communities and people who are passionate about that have protest voted, sometimes at Labour's expense. And it sounds like for you, they just went spoiled ballots.
Yeah, there was definitely a shift towards us as well, but it was a shift we had to fight for and campaign for. So, and it was about a week out from the election where we were talking. We went to this part of, like I said, this three-way marginal, and we did a big session there. And there was a lot of just anger. And I don't think Labour's quite encapsulated just how big that anger is. I've been saying for some time that it is, but it's sticking as well. Because genuinely, I thought that, once David Lammy came out and said, yes, we want a ceasefire, etc., I thought that anger might abate. And it was like, okay, so what do we do if Labour get another 100 votes in that polling district? How are we going to offset that? And all the kind of calculations you do. But it just didn't. It just keeps on rolling and rolling. And even now, and apparently in some of the wards where we're not competitive in urban Preston, there was a trade unionist socialist party thing. Now, they got absolutely no votes. But what it did do is it absolutely distracted Labour. I mean, they were, and it became quite personal and nasty apparently in some of the Labour councillors. So I didn't obviously have anything involved with that because it wasn't areas where we're strong. But it is something that Labour have got to consider, Mark. And I don't know if that or what an issue that was in London, or Martin, if you want to come in. But we'll go Mark, then Martin.
I mean, I think you're right. It's an issue across the whole country. In fact, there were some BBC figures about, in the most heavily Muslim wards, what the vote share changes were. And our vote was up a couple of points in those wards, along with, Green vote being up as well and so on. So there was definitely a bit of people coming to us. I think one thing that is, I guess, a tricky judgment to make is how long lasting that political effect will be. Because in many ways, if you think about, say, the Iraq War in the Tony Blair days, that definitely had a big short-term effect in many places.
Yeah, I agree.
But it didn't really follow through. And, even in the immediate vicinity of, say, the 2005 general election, the pattern of, say, where we did well and where Labour did badly was sort of the pattern you might have expected pre-Iraq war as well, given that it was a Labour government that, for other reasons, had run into some unpopularity as well. So there was a bit of an effect, but it wasn't that big, and it sort of faded. I think there is something different, though, about, well, both Ukraine and Gaza and the West Bank, that both of them have a real emotional pull on people in a way that is actually quite hard to explain. Why did so many people react so strongly to Russia's second invasion of Ukraine, but not to the first, or to the invasion previously of Georgia, and so on? And likewise, why is it that we get marches in central London about Gaza, but not about the Uyghurs in China?
Yeah.
And there are also, obviously, all circumstances are different, and one can't make, an exact comparison between, say, the treatment of the Uyghurs and Gaza Strip. But it is really striking that those two different sort of international tragedies at the moment really have a strong emotional appeal on people. You see Ukrainian flags up in people's windows around the place. Yeah. Why Ukraine out of all of the other? And so I think, and this comes back to what you were saying, is there is a strength of emotion there that I think outlasts, as you say, things like David Lammy's comments. And I suspect the real question is whether that gets channeled into effective political organisation or not. And in some cases, that may be us, where we're able to win new support in those communities. Where it gets channeled into George Galloway type parties, that is also, it's dramatic, but also very limiting. You look at George Galloway's views and comments on so many other things, it's a bit of a niche dead end, rather than something that really you can imagine remaking politics on a bigger scale. But it's one of the reasons why, there will be plenty of detail to pore over with interest at future elections, I'm sure.
Just before Martin comes in, because I did that, and then we'll bring back Hannah. It was just on that, just because I'll forget it. So I got contacted by one of these interfaith groups that tries to do community cohesion and stuff within places, and they were talking about they were inviting me to various events and stuff like that. And I said, look, I'm really interested in this because I'm going to be honest. Like most Lib Dem parties, we are predominantly white. We are white and male, and generally over 40 is the thing. So I really, as a leader of a local party, really want to improve that. It's not good enough that we don't look like the people we're trying to represent. And I said to the chap that contacted me, I said, look, I'd love to come to all these events, please do. But I'm really conscious I don't want to be seen as taking political capital out of the suffering that's going on in Gaza. And I said, look, and I'm really, really conscious of this, that I don't want to hurt your reputation, or be seen as being absolutely so political that I would happily get votes on the backs of dead babies and things like that. So it is a really difficult balancing act to get. And with that, Martin,
well, I suppose I was thinking about this, and I don't want to in any way downplay the severity of the issues, but I was just thinking in terms of why aren't we getting more of the protest vote? Well, I think sometimes it's campaigning's around making choices, and choices have consequences, and some of them good, some of them less good. But it's not been our focus of our message. I don't know what it's been like in individual local areas, because obviously I haven't seen it. But in terms of the strategy and the messaging of the issues we're focusing on, it's not that one. So you can have a policy which is in tune with what people are looking for, but if it's not part of your core messaging, it's not going to come through quite so much. But that can be the case without thinking, well, we should have talked about this more. Whereas, no, actually, we should have been talking about the things that we were talking about. But that doesn't mean we're going to take absolutely everyone with us as a result of it. And I think, it's going to be people who are really focusing on that issue that are going to pick up the most. Also, the point about David Lammy said this, and, is that going to make it go away? Well, but equally, it's not really what they've been talking about most. And a lot of the media channels, it's not going to be in their interest to pick up something that's favourable to Labour, so they're not necessarily going to convey that message. So you're not going to get that secondary effect out of it. I think it's interesting, and I don't know about this, but I do wondering where some of the areas that the Greens have done really well, whether they have possibly focused on it a bit. I don't know, but I know that, for example, in Hastings, the Labour group fell apart over the last few months. Half of them left the Labour Party. It was one of those areas where that happened over Gaza. And then in this election, there's been a massive Green surge to the extent that the Green are Hastings Council. So, maybe some of that is going on as well.
Oh, the Greens are definitely. I've definitely come. I mean, Hannah, I am going to bring in just because again, I keep wondering because at the Gaza, there was a big Gaza rally in Preston for all of Lancashire, and the speakers were saying, don't vote Labour, don't vote Conservative, vote for an independent or a Green. Now we didn't come into that conversation at all, but it's obviously something that Greens have got themselves aligned with that. Now that comes with risks as well, but I think Greens have definitely done that, and I'm absolutely sure some of the benefit the Greens have had these local elections has come from that. Hannah?
Yeah, so you've just alluded to the point that I was going to make actually, John, which is that a lot of the this is, I think we've talked more about this issue than we ever have on the podcast, really, because it's it's always a bit of a dangerous one, and I think it's important to note that a lot of the parties and also individuals with that really strong, pro-Palestine sentiment really tip over into both subtle and quite overt anti-Semitism. And that is something that, we as a party absolutely will not tolerate. And if not being seen to be anti-Semitic means not being the default protest vote on this matter, I think we are all really quite happy with that. None of us want to be put in the same category as George Galloway. Thank you very much. And I think, Martin, in terms of messaging as well, I think, as Lib Dems, we absolutely go out of our way to keep local elections about local things. So our messaging on these elections has been about, potholes and bin collections, rightly so, because we want to be a trusted hand in local government. We know that the Greens are not a trusted hand in local government. Their record in local government shows that. And we know that both Labour and the Conservatives have a strong history of taking their residents for granted when it comes to running their councils and offering their council services. So that's been the message that we've run on, and I think we can be really satisfied at the gains we've had on that basis.
Yeah. Go on, Martin. I don't know where you want to come.
I was going to say, and to the extent that we tend to tie in with more national themes as part of our local campaigning, it's been our core messaging, I would imagine, of cost of living crisis, NHS, sewage, stroke environmental stuff, rather than sort of extra national considerations. So, but those are the right things that we need to be doing to target, to have the most success where we think we can get it.
I suppose, I mean, my thing on the Greens, I want to talk a little bit about the level of campaigning we kind of saw in this thing. So one thing I do worry about with Lib Dems is that we tend to pull our punches, I think, against the Greens, to the point where we don't actually, because some Green parties, and so if you look back at the Green Party manifesto in 2019, it is nuts. It is genuinely bonkers. And I think because we align on issues of the environment mostly, that we think, and we allow them to gain a foothold, and they then use our tactics against us, but with added little bits of protest vote that they get, so it becomes a bit more difficult to get them out once they're embedded. But I'm interested to hear from the panel actually about how they thought the level of campaigning was in your patches, because for me, I was nervous going into this because we had multiple elections, the Police and Crime Commission, sometimes mayoralties. We knew, and don't forget the general election as well. So you could have had lots of literature solely from a general election candidates that wouldn't have counted on local election expenses. So I was genuinely worried that we would get outspent and almost kind of papered over, but actually that really didn't happen, and I was genuinely surprised. And there's a big debate going on in Preston Labour now about how we beat them, But actually, the volume of literature and campaigning they did was really poor. Now, I get we're not in the hotbed, and I was talking to some of our colleagues in Stockport, which was obviously a lot more and gets a lot more leaflet, but I still don't think it was masses. I don't know, what was the feeling on the ground for you, Mark?
I think it was pretty promising. I mean, I guess there are two statistics that help measure that in a more objective way. One is that we had a couple of weeks before polling day, we released the figure that we had just knocked on our 2 millionth door so far this year, which is a very, very healthy number compared to previous years. Our records don't go back that long, but it is, a very, very healthy figure compared to the previous years that we do have records for. And the other is our number of candidates, which is also, again, a good sign of our strength on a broader base. Because in our strongest areas, we stand, a full slate or very close to a full slate all the time. So the candidate numbers ebbing and flowing is a sign of how we're doing in the less strong areas. And our candidate numbers were up again. There's still, some way to go to get them to be up, consistently level with Labour and the Tories in council elections. But when candidate numbers are up and canvassing is up, that shows something quite positive, particularly because neither of those figures can be good just on the basis of our areas where we've got high parliamentary hopes. They're only good because of a breadth of success.
Yeah. Hannah, your impressions on the ground, how hard was the campaigning actually in Barnsley and Yorkshire for your wider mayoralty?
I mean, Barnsley Labour just remain really bad at campaigning.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll find out because, like I said, go on, Martin.
But just one little anecdote I'll just give, because obviously we didn't have a lot of campaigning around here because all we had was PCC, and that meant that there was very little campaigning by anybody. But the really funny part was, so the Tories have been putting some mass distribution stuff out with Rishi Sunak and our local MP on it, which I don't know how much that's doing for him. But then actually, all of a sudden, Rishi Sunak turned up in our town, in our local shopping centre, to launch an initiative about, how there shouldn't be abuse and threatening behaviour towards retail staff. So him and the PCC and our MP went into our local booths and threw all of the customers out and talked to a few people for a few minutes. But Horsham's been a Conservative seat since 1880. It's like one of the safest in the country. So the only fallout that came as a result of Rishi Sunak turning up was everybody in the street sort of went, wow, Conservatives must be really worried about Horsham.
Yeah, but I suppose we should talk about the third party of the year. So let's talk about the Tories. Okay, so it was a disaster. Obviously, Ben Houchen winning in Tees Valley was an early result, so that helped him. But I struggle to see too many rays of light within the Tories. I mean, does anyone have any optimism for them? I mean, like I said, they're not going to go away, but that was pretty brutal to lose that many. Hannah?
Yeah, like I say, there's definitely a bit of a sticky red wall Tory vote still. I guess that's the thing that reform has the potential to spoil for them. I mean, yeah, it's dire, isn't it? It was always going to be dire. It was dire, and I didn't actually watch any of it because I couldn't abide it. But clearly, Suella Braverman was doing the morning rounds, wasn't she, yesterday, getting the knife in anywhere she possibly.
Is she doing that? Is she doing that because it's so bad that she doesn't want to be leader before the general election? Because why would you want that poison chalice? She's just setting herself up because no Tory who wants to be prime minister is going to want to be prime minister for a month.
No.
So she, yeah.
I still don't. I don't think there'll be a leadership contest. As you say, who would want that? No. I mean, I try not to get into Suella Braverman's head, but yeah, I suspect she's lining herself up for afterwards. And I still don't think that there will be a general election before November. I think because he's going to lose, isn't he? The second he calls that general election, unless he thinks, do you know what? If I do it now, I can go and spend the summer in, I don't know, Mustique or wherever it is he likes to go. you know, unless he thinks, oh, do you know what, I'm done, I'm bored. Let's just pull the plug, and then I can go and, you know, enjoy the, I don't know, kids' summer holidays or something.
I'm gonna have to get Mark's knowledge on this, because I know that the Tories lost all but one of their metro mayors. They kept Tees Valley. How did they do in London? I know not the mayoralty. I know about Susan Hall, but actually the Greater London Assembly. I think Susan Hall got elected.
Yeah, so they went backwards a bit in London. I mean, I guess if you're looking for sources of optimism for the Tories, I think it would come from the fact that, although the swing against Ben Houchen was huge, and so they shouldn't make too much out of his win, but nonetheless, he did win. And although, you know, Andy Street, people's views of that result are massively tainted by a small number of votes one way or another, but nonetheless, he did relatively well compared to many other Tories, is that between Houchen and Street, there is a picture there of a future path for the Conservative Party that is very different from the Suella Braverman, Priti Patel, etc. path. And whilst in Suella Braverman's backyard in the local elections, they got tonked by the Lib Dems, Ben Houchen is, you know, back in, well, today's a bank holiday when we're recording it, so back in work tomorrow morning in office. That said, there are very few signs the Tories are drawing the right lesson from that. You know, if you look at who was on the Sunday media round and what they were saying, it seemed like they're a party that's at the mood of being draw absolutely the wrong conclusion from the results. But you would have to say, you know, the fact that somebody like Andy Street, you know, can get very, very close to winning in the West Midlands. And, you know, had he not been the incumbent, we would all be thinking, wow, they got so close, what an amazing man he is, etc. Now, of course, he did have the incumbency factor as well, so it's not quite a like comparison. But you sort of think there is a model, and who knows? I mean, I've seen a couple of Tory figures speculating about, well, you know, wonder whether he'll become an MP and be a future leader of the Tory party. You know, you can imagine, if you think about how Boris Johnson went from being mayor to leader of the Conservative Party, and indeed winning an election for them, for all of his other disasters and all the many things we don't like about him. What odds that Ben Houchen or Andy Street end up being a future leader of the Tory party?
Well, someone said, and I'm trying not to panic my colleague and friend who just got elected on the council, but is also the parliamentary candidate for Fylde, there is a spare seat there in one of the safest constituencies in Lancashire. And would Andy Street go there and be almost certain? Because after Mark Menzies has obviously now been booted by. And
can I just say one other thing about Ben Houchen, though, because I think which really nicely illustrates how Tories are in a way not drawing the right lesson, which is one of the things he's well known for is essentially nationalising the airport. And so, you know, that's very much the Boris Johnson 2019, I'm going to spend all of this money on lots of new public services, new hospitals, new police and all that. And yes, they haven't delivered on those things, but that was a big part of his appeal in 2019. It wasn't the right-wing, cut taxes, small state approach. It was big government, big spending. Who was perhaps their most successful candidate in the elections this time? Ben Houchen, proponent of nationalisation. Now, I suspect he doesn't want to nationalise much else, but isn't that really strikingly symbolic? And yet that's just not the world that Priti Patel and Suella Braverman are living in terms of the lessons they think should be drawn.
Mine?
Yeah. Just interesting point you said a little while ago. No one wants to be prime minister for a month. Well, you know, it's been done. So, you know, I mean,
and to be clear, I would take that offer if that was available. To be clear, if anyone out there is willing to, make it happen.
Yeah, but you know what? Realistically, what do they do? Because in one shape or form, over the last year, 2 years, they've tried everything, and none of it has worked. And almost the fact that they've tried so many things is a problem for them.
I think
now.
They should try nationalising Heathrow and Gatwick.
But
that's
I think,
clearly the Ben
I'm worried about, in a way, about what I'm seeing just as a member of the public in terms of what seems to be getting traction, or the things that people are saying from the Tories that are getting traction. What's the, you know, your David Frosts and your Ian Duncan Smiths and your Suella Bravermans? What's the recipe for success? Well, more tax cuts, more cuts in public spending. Leave the European Court of Human Rights and deport more refugees.
Yeah,
okay.
I think we've talked about this on the podcast before, the psychological effect of doubling down on your mistakes, that it takes a while for you to come back from that. And I think if I was a Tory right now, you've got to acknowledge that you're going to get your ass whooped in the next election, but it's about the election after that. And I know that's a really harsh thing to have to think about, but it's like and we had to do it during coalition. Sometimes right, how are we going to build back once this is the current set of direness has passed on? And what the Tories are doing, they're reaching for an absolute kind of silver bullet which doesn't exist, and so they're trying mad things. And actually, if there's still a massive core of people in this fight, and I do think Lib Dems have to be careful with our messaging, because this idea, I know, and I love the dinosaur stunt that we did, but there will always be a centre-right party, and so our messaging saying they're going extinct, they're not. People just want to break from them, and I think that it's a different message they're going to put forward. And I think for the Tories to actually come back, I think you've got to pretend like you are the sensible party again, and actually start doing things and saying things that hit that moderate level. Don't try crazy ideas on a magic bullet. Think, okay, if we're sensible and we're consistent with this line about things, they will eventually tick back up. But I just don't think they've got the patience for it. Or maybe I'm just a politician that has more kind of patience than normal, Mark.
I guess you're half right. Because I
I'll
think under first past the post, half is
it's a winning margin.
Because I think if you look at the Conservative Party in the past, they are the dominant electoral force in British politics. For a long period of time since 1945, they've won 2/3 of all general elections, even if you include 1945 in that calculation. So they are but the way they have come back in the past is by reinventing themselves. And so I think there is a form of Conservative Party that is in danger of extinction now for them. The question is whether they manage to reinvent themselves as they have in the future, whether they look to, airport nationalising Ben Houchen, or indeed whether coming to, say Martin's part of the world, if they have a bad general election result, do they start worrying about the fact that they're nowhere pretty much now in London, in much of London, the fact that they might have their worst election result for a huge long time in Surrey, the fact that similar story may well be the case in Sussex, they may be a party that is suddenly worried about Sussex and Surrey and London, and that might take them in a very different direction from the Red Wall focus and the Priti Patel and Suella Braverman focus, or ironically given in part, what seats, for example, Suella Braverman represents. But, there's a very different potential future path for the Tories, which may become clearer to them, and they may decide to take, when they look at or over the election results from the home counties and suddenly think, you know what, there's a different problem we have here. The lack of interest in the Tory party about how badly they have done in London over the last decade or so is really striking. London politics used to be actually quite similar to national politics, levels of Labour and Tory support. And the Tories have been massively on the slide now. And yet, where is the worry in the Tory party about what's our future in London?
It's genuinely fascinating, because I remember that I was listening to something about, will the Tories go the same way as the Canadian Tories, Canadian Conservatives, who actually I think went down to 2, and then weirdly enough there was a Reform Party that joined then, and
then they merged, and
then they tacked back to the middle again in order to try and get back into power. So it's generally, but I mean, these results give no comfort to the Tories in terms of a general election, that they are getting hit everywhere, and Reform will win no seats at all. Even if Farage comes back, I don't believe Reform will get a single MP, and actually I don't think the Greens will get a single MP either. But the Tories are just on such a track of destruction. I don't know what they're going to be left with. Just a rump of absolutely solid seats probably at the end, and even then will be watered down a lot. But I suppose we want to end on a positive. So let's end on a really positive Lib Dem message, because actually what this does for our general election stuff, and there has been various stuff this evening about where we need to win, and Martin alluded to it earlier. We are winning in places where we need to for the general election, and it will take, we have had a good set of elections in Preston. Are we likely to win the Preston constituency off Labour this time? No. And I think if anyone is a member of the ALDC and read Hannah Kitchen's excellent piece on what we need to do now, in essence, we have 50 or so really important target seats that we need to treat like by-elections between now, because that election could come at any point. I think it will still come in the autumn. There's rumours today that he thought about going in the summer, which is bonkers. But I don't think he'll also wait till January.
When you've jinxed it now, John. The election will get called the day before this podcast gets published.
Yeah, that's right. The lectern's already out. That's absolutely right. But for us Lib Dems and for us campaigners, make sure you are prepped. We are already planning action days to go help those really key parliamentary seats, because what we don't want to do is repeat those mistakes that Dorothy Hornhill report was very clear about, where we spread ourselves too thin and win nothing, or very little. So, and also things you can do as your campaigners. Don't forget, if you've had local elections, give your council staff a week or so, get hold of those marked registers. All that data I was talking about how we were able to target certain voters, one of the best pieces of data you can get, even if you don't do as much canvassing as we do up here, is get hold of that marked register. And a prime example, I'll give you one we used. So in 2021, the Tories were really high. We targeted Tories that hadn't voted since 2021 with a kind of don't let Labour win here message, and it really worked. But we could only do that with marked register data. So make sure you get your marked registers. And I suppose final thoughts from the group as we go into the general election run-up now. I suppose this is the last electoral test. Martin, your final thoughts on a good local election campaign?
Well, yes, very much so. And I think I just want to touch on something, and Mark can tell me whether I'm right about this or not, but I just wanted to mention Woking in particular, actually, because I think I'll get the figures right on this, but we took control of Woking last year, maybe the year before. They took over a council from the Conservatives that had debt of over £2 billion, right? This is a district and borough side, £2 billion. The stuff that they're having to deal with is unbelievably horrendous and shocking. I can't imagine it as being a council leader being faced with that. They've just got rid of the last Tory on Woking Council. The Tories are gone. Okay, Labour picked up one or two as well, but they've removed them completely. So I don't know enough about what they've been campaigning on and how it's been going, but they must be doing something really right in office as well to actually be increasing in that situation rather than receding. So well done, Woking.
Well said, Martin. Hannah, your final message?
Yeah, it just occurred to me, John, we failed to talk about the PCC and mayoral elections. So
we touched on it a little bit.
I think it might be useful if we have another podcast about that one, because these are very, very, very expensive, tedious, ultimately proved to be fruitless elections.
Hannah really enjoyed that one.
So to be fair, we did have a couple of really quite good results. I can't pull them off the top of my head, I'm afraid, Mark, but we did have a couple of really quite good results in the PCC elections in places where we're good, and the sort of general consensus seems to be that these are a bit of an afterthought for the party. I think, to be fair, they're an afterthought for every party. I don't think it's exclusive to us, and in some of those areas where we are strong locally, strong at parliamentary level, do we need to look at selecting those PCC candidates for 4 years' time now and actually start actively campaigning on that? No in Yorkshire is the answer, but certainly possibly in some other places.
Mark, final thoughts from you?
So traditional Lib Dem style, I guess I should go for 3 final thoughts. So number one, just to echo Hannah's point, definitely there's lots to pick over about the mayor and PCC contests, and huge thanks to all of our candidates in those, especially. Particularly Rob in London, who did a brilliant job, got us back into 3rd. We won our first ever constituency seat, but he therefore missed out on election to the Assembly himself by a tiny, tiny margin. It was a real shame. But overall, in the PCC elections, our vote share was up 3%, which I think is a promising sign of a growing breadth of popularity, not just about target seats. So that's sort of number one. We should take hope from our PCC vote share being up. Second thought is on your point about Woking, Martin. I gave them a party award at our spring conference for the best delivery network in the country. And I think one of the things they've got really right is having a very large team of volunteers. So when all of your activists suddenly get elected as councillors, and my goodness in Woking above all, are then massively busy, desperately trying to sort out what the heck to do on the council, the campaigning carries on. And there's an important lesson there about, you're absolutely right, Martin, about the politics of a council where, getting the politics of dealing with a big problem right. But alongside it, they've had the campaign machinery to get the right message out. And you've got to have both. You've got to have both. The third thing is, I'll just share one number, which when I shared it with Daisy Cooper a few weeks ago, she said made her feel sick, but makes me feel really optimistic. So view this as a personality test. The number is 34,843, which is if 34,843 people in the places that matter had switched from Lib Dem to our rivals at the last election, we would have 0 MPs. So under 35,000 people could have wiped us out completely in Westminster. Daisy said that figure makes her sick, but I am excited and energized by that figure, because think about the glass half full version of it. Think about the difference any one of us can hope to make in an election. That shows how even on the national scale of a general election, if we smartly put our efforts into the places that matter most, we can really make a big difference to what the national story is in an election. That 35,000 people, that would have been a big different national story. 0 MPs versus 11. 11 was disappointing, but imagine if we'd started this parliament on 0. Imagine where we would now be, say, in Preston, John, if there'd been a complete wipeout in Westminster in there. So that, I think, is the thing we should take heart from. The PCC elections show there is, a bit of a tide in our favour, and that figure shows that we can make a real difference even. And if the tide is in our favour a bit, it can be a real difference, not between extinction and survival, but between survival and huge hope for what we can achieve.
Absolutely. That's lovely, Mark. Thank you for that. That's a really good end to the episode. We will be doing loads more episodes coming up. I've got one in mind where I want to get everyone an episode on getting yourself ready for this next year. Because actually, we have a general election followed by county elections, and you are going to be knackered. And actually, what you can do now, and I don't just mean getting your thank you leaflets designed, getting your canvas cards for the year ready, making sure you've got your data ready for the general election, all that sort of stuff will be part of it, but actually making sure you're healthy and are ready for this next year, because this is a seminal year in politics. And Martin's having a little chuckle and a giggle there, because he knows, as someone who's got county elections next year, what a big year next year could be. Because actually, and I'm a glass half full kind of guy as well, Mark. I would say, we were looking at maybe a perfect point next year where Labour in power, Tories reeling from a bad election defeat. There's an opportunity there in counties where we're pretty strong, or have had historically been quite strong, to do something marvellous. So we'll leave you with that optimism. But thank you. Oh no, Martin wants to come in. Okay, Martin, he's going to crush me.
He also knows what change of control does for your health.
Yeah, okay, that's right. We'll also do a podcast episode on how to cope if you suddenly end up as a council leader. But thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Thank you so much for everything you're doing out there. I got lots of messages over the course of the campaign of people who say they listen to the podcast while they're delivering and things like that, and it means a lot. And you mean a lot to this party, because as Mark's just said, none of us who actually are elected can do this on our own. We are a team, and we all need those teams to function well and be happy and healthy and enjoy beating the Tories and Labour or SNP or whoever you are. So thank you so much. Thank you very much for listening. If you're watching on the podcast, hello, it's good to be back. We will have more frequent episodes coming up because I've been a little bit busy. And don't forget, you can follow everything to do with the Nevermind the Bar Charts podcast and the Lib Dem podcast on all your social media. So if you've got any questions, just ask. But on behalf of myself, Martin, Hannah, and Mark, thank you very much and have a nice day.